Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Baltic Breakfast. I hope you've set up a nice little breakfast for yourselves there at home. My name is Hanna Sjölund, and I'm an advocacy officer here at the Baltic Sea Centre at Stockholm University. And I'll just say a few words about who we are here today. We're a scientific centre. But what we try to do is we try to function as a bridge between science and policy, facilitating the uptake of science in political decision making. And we do this to a number of themes. We have climate all over, but then with biodiversity, eutrophication, fisheries, and environmental pollutants, with a source to sea thinking there. We also have a number of publications, policy briefs, namely in this respect. And I've here listed a few of the ones that we have in the fields of chemicals. And you can find all of these on the website baltic.org. But today we're here to talk about the chemical strategy. It's been long awaited. And it was presented by the European Commission in the mid of October, earlier this autumn. It's part of the current Commission's big Green Deal. And the overall aim of this strategy is to reduce the risks associated with producing and using chemicals. It contains 56 actions, or instruments if you want, that will all be rolled out between now and 2024. And it will range from a number of measures. It's soft measures, it's hard measures, and it's aiming at boosting innovation and protecting human health and environment against the hazardous chemicals. It is also part of the Europe's zero pollution ambition, which is overarching as well, together with the biodiversity and the farm to fork strategy. So these are the three strategies under there. And next year, we're going to see an EU action plan towards a zero pollution ambition for air, water and soil, which will more clearly connect it with the environmental side there, the downstream side. And as such, the chemical strategy will be the first upper leg of this pollution down to the sea source thinking. So, for us here at the Baltic Sea Centre, hazardous chemicals in the Baltic Sea is of course a great concern. And so we have to work both upstream and downstream to come to terms with this situation. And we have here today with us three experts that will help us discuss this. First out, we have Christina Rudén, who's a professor in regulatory Ecotoxicology and Toxicology at the Department of Environmental Science at Stockholm University. And then we have Ian Cousins, who's a professor in contaminant chemistry at the same department here at Stockholm University. And then lastly, we have Mikael Karlsson, who's an associate professor in environmental science at the Department of Philosophy at KTH, the Royal Institute of Technology. But first out, we have Christina. So, will the EU chemical strategy deliver? Christina, you have the floor. Christina?
Yes, I'm here. I will.
Yes.
Thank you, Hanna, for that start and the introduction, and thank you for having me at the breakfast. When I laid my hands on this, I became a little bit excited already at the first row because it says a toxic-free environment. And as you know, in Sweden, we've had the environmental objective, a non-toxic environment for quite a while now, but that expression has been really contested and controversial in Europe and among different stakeholders. So just introducing this toxic-free environment sort of, to me, indicated something new. And as I kept reading it, I actually became quite enthusiastic because I think this is a very good policy. And I have chosen to just mention a few highlights that I am particularly happy about. This is a figure from the strategy, and it shows that it rests on two major legs. So it's a lot about protection of health and the environment, but it's also a big part on encouraging innovation. But also this figure here, the triangle, is something new and important because it says that we should promote safe and sustainable chemical, and that should be the big part. But there's also a mid part where we should actually minimize and control exposures to hazardous chemicals, and also, of course, keep eliminating exposure to the most hazardous chemicals. I think this is a really clear picture of the strategy forward, or a clear summary that is important. In my short presentation here, I will not talk a lot about innovation, but focus on the parts that is about protecting health and the environment. So several groups are mentioned in the strategy. So the aim is to increase the safety of children, but also consumers and workers. And one thing that the strategy aims to do is to ensure that consumer products do not contain chemicals that cause cancer, gene mutations, or reproductive toxicants, or endocrine disruptors, or are PBT chemicals that remain in the environment and don't degrade and can also be accumulated in human tissue. So those are the usual suspects, but the strategy also points out that we need to control chemicals that affect the immune system, neurodevelopment or respiratory systems, and chemicals that are toxic to specific organs. So it expands the scope of chemicals in need of control. And that is new and that is important. We have long fought to get a European definition of endocrine disruptors. But what is still lacking, and of course very, very important, is to have data requirements so that we actually can use the definition to identify endocrine disrupting chemicals. And this is now foreseen in the new strategy for a selection of legislations, at least the ones that are listed here: REACH, plant protection products, biocides, food contact materials, and cosmetics. So that is certainly a long-awaited and important step forward in the control of endocrine disruptors. The criteria for endocrine disruption will also be added to REACH. And again, we have here also two new sets of criteria for persistent, toxic, and mobile chemicals, and for very persistent and very mobile chemicals. So again, this is new types of hazards that will also be important for the protection of the ocean. There is also a plan to introduce risk management of mixtures. That has also been discussed for decades now, so it's really, really nice if we can take a step forward here. So the Commission suggests that we should assess how to best introduce in REACH a mixture assessment factor or different factors. So it doesn't say if, it says how. And a mixture assessment factor, I think, is a good pragmatic way to easily deal with, not easily, but at least pragmatically deal with mixtures and the risks associated with co-exposures. And it also says that we need to introduce or reinforce mandates in different legislations to actually take combination effects into account. And again, there is a number of legislation that is mentioned, like water, food contact materials, food additives, toys, detergents, and cosmetics. And I am, of course, particularly happy to see this, since this was also two things that we suggested in our report to the government that came approximately a year ago. There's also, the strategy also covers measures to improve data availability and transparency in the system, which is really, really nice and good. So one point is to make better regulatory use of data produced by academia. We have tried to promote that for, I mean, at least a decade. So that's really, really nice to see that happen. There's a lot of good research going on at the university that are currently not picked up really sufficiently by the regulatory system. And that's really a waste of taxpayers' money. So we're very happy about this. Increased transparency is also important, and this is now coming within the food law, but the strategy says that this should be expanded also to other pieces of legislation, which is also super welcome. It's also foreseen to revise the registration requirements to include more data about critical hazardous properties, to move towards grouping, which is very important and that will increase the efficiency of the legislation. We're talking about the overall environmental footprint of chemicals, including climate aspects. Increasing the requirements for low volume chemicals and also registration of some polymers, plastics. So all these are things that will help and improve the system, in my view. There's also a thing about promoting or ensuring even legal compliance to REACH legislation, and actually amending REACH to make ECHA to make it possible for ECHA to actually revoke a registration in cases of non-compliance. And this has been, of course, more or less a loophole in the legislation that has not been possible until now. So it's a very welcome revision of this important legislation, considering also that ECHA repeatedly has seen that 2/3 of all registration does not fulfill the legal requirements. So in general, these were just a few examples of really welcome issues in the strategy, but of course there are things that are still missing, a number of things. For instance, we need to start moving away from the regulatory silos where we regulate and risk assess chemicals separately depending on their intended use. So we need something cross-cutting to make the assessments more holistic and coherent. The innovation part of this strategy sort of implicitly refers to substitution, but the substitution principle is not really strong in current legislation. So I think we need to both introduce and reinforce this principle in the different legislations. And what is not discussed at all, I think, is the conflict of interest inherent in the system, where we have put a lot of responsibilities on the chemical producing industry, but we have not stepped up in terms of supervision and enforcement of that responsibility. So I think we need to, in the future, take a step back and actually strengthen the role of the authorities again. And of course, what is really missing and really wanted is that the chemical producing industry starts to take full responsibility for its products and also contribute to a development, a fast development towards safer chemicals. And I think the example of PFAS that Ian is now going to tell us about shows the need for industry also to step up and help with this development more than they're doing today. The strategy is short. I can recommend to read it as a whole, but in particular, I would like to point to Annex 1 that contains the 56 action points. Please print it and put it beside your desk and look at it every day, because that's the way we are going now. From what I've seen and heard, the Commission, the Parliament, and also the member states, they seem really committed to actually implement this strategy. And of course, implementation is key, because a strategy is just a piece of paper. We need to fill it with actions and results. So we need also to follow the implementation and keep pressure in the system, because then I think when implemented, this strategy will be a major step forward towards protection of human health and the environment. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Christina. That was very interesting. It was a good list through of what's needed. Hang on there just a little while. Okay, yeah. I just have a short question for Christina before we get going, Ian. It was a good list of what's missing and what needs to be addressed, and that you read it with a positive. You were positively taken by the strategy, and that there's lots that can really be work well there. I was just thinking, you have recently attended your first expert meeting in the Caracal group from Stockholm University. Which was in a sense a very good momentum just after the chemical strategy comes out. What was your what was the feeling that you were left with leaving that meeting? Is it really a positive atmosphere in moving forward with these issues, or is it a feeling of lots of hurdles that need to be overcome?
Well, of course, it's a little bit of both. The chemical strategy was presented at that meeting and discussed fairly during quite a long discussion, but that discussion was really, really positive. And many of the member states expressed their full support for the strategy and also seemed like enthusiastic for actually wanting to implement it. And of course, we asked the Commission about the implementation, and they, as I said, they seem really committed to do something about this. But then, as always, the devil is in the details. So, for instance, we discussed also this registration of polymers, and there we can directly go into controversial stuff where there is now a consultancy report that says that, yeah, we should register polymers, but look, there are only very, very few polymers that we actually should register. So we continuously need to follow the implementation. The scientists need to go into the details. They need to actually feed into the decision process also these scientific arguments at different stages and different levels and for different issues. So this, as I said, the strategy is just a paper, and we need to help filling it with really good content.
Yeah. We should definitely print it out and have it next to our desk. We're now going to get, thank you very much, we're now going to get a very good example of how we can see uptake directly from academia into the strategy. And so, Ian, without any further ado, you have the floor.
Okay, you can see my slides, I guess. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. Well, thank you. Good morning, and thanks so much for inviting me to Baltic Breakfast. Today, I'd like to share my personal reflections on the EU's chemical strategy. And as you can tell from the title, I'd particularly like to draw your attention to the concept of essential use, which is mentioned throughout the EU's chemical strategy. I'd like to start with my take-home messages. So my two most important reflections are as follows. Firstly, I noted that green chemistry principles are now strongly incorporated throughout the chemical strategy. This is a movement to a proactive or upstream policy approach where chemicals in society should be designed to be safe and sustainable. Now, this term safe and sustainable is also a new term introduced recently into EU chemicals policy and the Green Deal. And the reverse pyramid that Christina also showed on the bottom left of the slide is a key diagram in the report. You can see that the green part focusing on safe and sustainable chemicals is the largest part, whereas the red part focusing on elimination and remediation is the smallest. In other words, instead of focusing on cleaning up the pollution after the chemicals are released, society should focus on preventing the pollution from occurring in the first place. Of course, if existing chemicals in use are not safe and sustainable by design, they should be eliminated or phased out from society as well. So I applaud this progressive approach in policy. It will better ensure protection of the Baltic Sea and the European environment more generally from hazardous chemicals going forward. Secondly, and what I'll focus on mainly in this presentation, I wanted to point out the concept of essential use, which is, as I say, mentioned throughout the strategy document. And the concept is considered to be a way to speed up the phase out of many non-essential uses of hazardous substances. So I was particularly delighted to see the incorporation of the essential use concept as it was something that we developed at Stockholm University. Our paper on essential use was only published in May 2019. So we think this was quite astonishing that it was rapidly taken up into European chemicals policy already this year. We developed the idea to guide the phase out of per and polyfluoroalkyl substances, or PFAS. The goal was to phase out uses of PFAS unless uses are proven to be essential. We believed that there were many non-essential uses that could be rapidly phased out without developing alternatives. Our ideas are echoed in the EU chemical strategy. There's even a separate action plan on PFAS where these ideas are elaborated further. But in the EU chemical strategy, the essential use concept is more broadly applied to all hazardous substances. We also suggested this in the recommendations of our paper, but this is impressive that they took this, this recommendation forward. In our paper, we also came up with criteria for essentiality, which I don't have time to go into here. But in the chemical strategy, it mentions that the EU will come up with their own criteria for essentiality already next year. So a little background to the origin of the essential use concept. About 5 years ago, some international scientists, including me, wrote the MADRID statement. It was a statement calling for the restriction on the use of PFAS in society. It was signed by over 200 eminent scientists from around the world. And then the statement was primarily driven by our concerns regarding the high persistence of PFAS, but also, of course, their toxic effects. Now, PFAS are a very diverse class of chemicals. However, the fully fluorinated carbon chains that are in all PFAS make them highly resistant to degradation in the environment. In fact, PFAS are so persistent, they are often called the forever chemicals. It means that once released in the environment, they will remain there forever. But why are we concerned about this high persistence? Well, persistent chemicals have a nasty habit of accumulating in the environment, for example, in the Baltic Sea. In other words, their concentrations tend to increase over time. And once you finally realize that you have a problem, for example, a toxic effect, there's little you can do to reverse the contamination. As well as the high persistence, of course, there's concerns about the toxicity of PFAS, but we know that certain PFAS are toxic, just a few. In fact, we know very little about the toxicity of most of the other substances in the class, which is also a concern. However, although we called for the phasing out of all PFAS in the Madrid statement, we also realized that this was impractical to do in one step. Some uses of PFAS may serve a critical role for which alternatives do not exist. On the other hand, some may be non-essential and could be rapidly phased out. So we introduced this concept of essentiality for phasing out PFAS, but the concept originally comes from the Montreal Protocol on substances that deplete the ozone layer. And we adapted the criteria for essentiality from the Montreal Protocol and decided to apply them to PFAS and then even to all hazardous substances. But applying the concept of essentiality to all uses of PFAS is a formidable task, because we recently also identified in a paper that there are over 200 uses of PFAS in society. However, it's not an insurmountable task, and we've already begun. So maybe it's good to give you a couple of examples of what I think are non-essential uses of PFAS. So first, my colleagues identified recently the use of PFAS in a wide range of cosmetic products. So PFAS have been detected in hair products, mascara, foundations, face creams, sunblocks, skin creams, lip pencils, etc., masses of different cosmetics and personal care products. It also appears that the PFAS in these products had no essential function. It could be that they're added to provide water repellents and durability, but this really remains unclear. And when retailers and brands were confronted with this information, they rapidly agreed to phase out PFAS from their products. And you can see some of the well-known brands listed here, retailers and brands. And you can see this is clearly a non-essential use if they can phase them out so quickly. Another non-essential use is the use of PFAS in ski waxes. So work at Stockholm University undertaken nearly a decade ago by Merla Plasman in our department has demonstrated the long-term contamination of the environment with PFAS that occurs during events such as Vasaloppet pictured on this slide. Yes, it's true, fluorinated ski waxes do help you ski faster, but there's always been biodegradable alternatives that work quite well. In fact, these alternatives were available a long time before fluorinated waxes became on the market. And if all competitive skiers used PFAS-free ski waxes, it would be a level playing field. And for average skiers like me, fluorinated ski waxes will only make a marginal difference. So this is another example of a non-essential use of PFAS. And this has been recognized by the International Ski Federation, who had banned the use of fluorinated ski waxes starting this season. But unfortunately, though, because of a lack of availability of testing methods, competitive skiers continue to use fluorinated ski waxes already this season, but we hope they'll be phased out soon. So although there are many success stories in the phase out of uses of PFAS, and I could give many more cases of non-essential uses, there's also a big task ahead because there are many uses, as you can see, over 200, and there are over 4,000 substances in the class. And we believe there are many uses of PFAS that are non-essential, and we can identify those and rapidly phase them out from society. However, there are some uses that may be considered essential. And this picture shows one example of a possible essential use of PFAS. It's their use in medical protective clothing, where they protect against viruses and other biological fluids, particularly during long operations in hospitals and things. And this use has been shown to be particularly important during the ongoing pandemic, I guess, where PFAS impregnated textiles can provide protection against a wide range of different liquids. And it's difficult to find alternatives that can do the same. But it doesn't mean that these uses should remain essential. And we should encourage innovation, as does the European chemical strategy, to find safe and sustainable alternatives where possible. So finally, I'd like to applaud the progressive chemicals policy that's baked into the EU chemical strategy. They do listen to researchers. Putting these ideas into practice will certainly meet many political challenges as well as opposition from the chemical industry, but I remain cautiously optimistic regarding its implementation. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was very interesting and a very welcome and nice example to see how quickly the uptake of academia can actually be into one of these like a strategy like the chemical strategy. I was just very short reflection. It was just interesting when you talk about the pandemic and how there can be this one essential use during long operations, for instance, in medicine. And then I was reading this article on the Metro this morning about how PFAS is a likely factor to reduce the amount of antibodies and then hindering the uptake of the coming COVID vaccine. Can that then be the discussion around essential, non-essential use, and how do we? It becomes a very complicated matter to deal with.
Yeah, there is some research on immunotoxicity. Regarding that COVID paper, I mean, I obviously this is a hot topic for many researchers to work on, sort of, COVID research right now. I think that it may be a bit early to draw too many conclusions regarding that particular paper, but there is definitely a link between PFAS and immunotoxicity. That is a serious concern, and actually drove the recent EFSA tolerable weekly intakes guidelines down quite considerably. That was the opinion that was recently published. That was basically driven by these concerns about immunotoxicity. So yeah, there definitely are some concerns regarding that. I don't want to speak particularly about that particular paper because I haven't really reflected on it in a lot of detail. It does worry me that it could be opportunistic because it comes right at the peak of a pandemic. But yeah, it's definitely of concern. It's been picked up by The Guardian and lots of other papers I noticed.
Okay. Well, thank you very much. Before we move on, I just remembered that I forgot to say that you can, of course, ask questions here today. And if you, on the website where you're watching this live streaming right now, a bit further down, you have instructions for how you can ask questions. You can use it via Slido, and you can use it by sending us an email. You have the addresses and the codes there. Also, if you discuss on Twitter, please use the hashtag Baltic Breakfast. So now we're going to move over to Mikael. And we're going to move over to more of the governance side. What will this mean for our region, and how do we connect all these different elements that need to come to place? So please, Mikael.
Well, thank you for that introduction, and thank you for inviting me to reflect a bit on this strategy. I will give some perspectives which would lead me to conclude that this strategy is, as far as we can see now, unique, but the question is still there. How much will things improve in reality? How much will we see of improvements in the Baltic Sea, for instance, when it comes to chemical contaminants? Why is it a unique strategy? Well, I would like to raise 4 points here. First is the policy context, which the strategy is included within. It's part of a very broad package from the center of the EU, the European Commission, and its proposal for a European Green Deal, which is one of the key policy proposals, key strategies for the Commission, and toxic substances are included. That's the first time ever we've seen it placed on such a central level. Secondly, the actors promoting and pushing here, well, it's the center of the Commission. It's not the Environment Directorate, but the President of the Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, and Frans Timmermans, who is Vice President of the Commission. And despite the pandemic, they really have delivered a number of proposals on the climate law, for instance, and now on this on a non-toxic environment. Thirdly, the aim, toxic-free, as Christina referred to previously, has been contested and debated for quite some time. And I would like to say now that both reason and science won in the fight about the overall objective for chemicals policy in the European Union. We need to push for a toxic-free environment, and that's the key objective of this strategy. Fourth, the approach here is holistic in a way, you could say. That there are several pieces of law that will be affected by the strategy. As far as it has been stated, there are more than 50 actions listed in the annex. So it's a strong push in the right direction, making this a unique package. But on the other side of the coin then, why are there concerns? Which are my key concerns here in terms of the eventual outcome in practice? What could this mean for the marine environment, for instance, or for human health more generally? Well, a first point here, I will raise 4 points that concern me a bit here. The first is about the legislative landscape. We can distinguish between producer-oriented pieces of legislation, like the REACH regulation on substances introduced to the market, on the one hand, and environment-oriented pieces of legislation that focus on limit values, marine compartments like the Water Framework Directive, the Marine Strategy Framework Directive, priority substance directives. There are no linkages here between these different types of laws. So if you find a pollutant in the marine environment in levels above thresholds, there is no automatic mechanism making sure that the producer-oriented pieces of legislation, you can say the gatekeeper on what's coming in on the market, is reacting. And this means that the environment will not improve much fundamentally in the long term unless we have linkages. And I don't see those linkages. The basic setup is more or less looking the same, even though more proposals will come eventually, et cetera, this bottleneck in the legislative landscape, this key problem is not really dealt with. It's not recognized as far as I can see in the way I would like it. to be formulated. Secondly, the legislative approach, if we say so. How do we look at producer-public relationship here? Christina referred to the relation between the responsibility of producers and the public side with supervision, control, etc., which has been very weak and in a reactive phase quite often. That is not really changed fundamentally by help of this proposal. And the asymmetric setup of this producer-oriented piece of legislation, the REACH regulation, where it's easy to introduce a substance and very difficult to take it off the market, even if all scientists in the world would agree that this is toxic to human health, we have high levels, we have high risks, it's still taking years and years and sometimes decades, and more than 1 decade, up to 2 decades sometimes. So the burden of proof for authorization and restriction still rests with the public side. So this is not a precautionary piece of legislation in those parts. And it's referred to that we need to reform authorization and restrictions in REACH, but how, well, we do not know that yet, how that will be done. Thirdly, if we zoom in on some details, the substitution principle, for instance, substitution is a key idea in dealing with hazardous substances, promoting a toxic-free environment. But substitution is just referred to once in the whole strategy. So it's not something that will permeate the system, the regulatory setup. And that's a main problem with the present legislation and with what has been presented so far. If we fourthly zoom out, we do not know yet what will come in addition to this strategy. There is now a consultation on an additional piece of document, which is an EU action plan towards a zero pollution ambition for air, water, and soil, which refers to, for instance, the marine environment. So that can be central, but how that will look like and what the linkages will be with the chemical safety strategy is still not clear. So if I summarize here, as I said, we can conclude that this is a unique document, but how much will be improved in reality, we do not know. It's promising, but it's far from realized yet. There will be a continued political process now between member states, European Parliament, a lot of stakeholders. I would say the jury is still out what this will result in reality, but so far I'm looking at this very positively, and I'm hoping for the best. And eventually, I guess science and reason will win again. And in the extension of that, we will have a toxic-free environment. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mikael. That was a very nice, positive ending. And building on that positive ending then, what would be your hope or wish for the Baltic Sea when it comes to what the impact of the chemical strategy could be?
Well, I would really like to see a legal mechanism between the pieces of law that focus on the aquatic, for instance, and the marine environment, so that when we find substances in the marine environment that should not be there, or that even might be above limit values, there needs to be a mechanism that really amends, for instance, the REACH regulation or other pieces of laws that can be relevant for what is introduced into the markets. Because if we do not have that mechanism, it is really not functioning well. But that's just the first step, because that's a reactive mode in a way. The proactive mode would, of course, be to focus more on inherent hazardous properties like endocrine disrupting substances, and really make this filter, the gatekeeper, much tighter. I guess what we will see here will be improvements, but the REACH regulation, when it came more than a decade ago, was the most debated and contested piece of law in the history of the EU. And chemicals industry and their consultants exaggerated the foreseen costs enormously, whereas the part of industry that applauded a strict control of chemicals, those producing cars or furnitures or clothes or selling food, etc., they woke up quite late, and this meant that the whole debate was very skewed and not balanced, and that led to a number of weaknesses in the REACH regulation before it was enacted. Hopefully we can now have a more balanced and nuanced debate and make this gatekeeping filter much stricter from start, enabling us to not be so dependent on this reactive mode of environment-oriented pieces of law.
Great, thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, so I'm gonna try and be quite quick here. Christina, you mentioned, can you say yes so I get you on screen?
Yes, I'm here.
Perfect. You mentioned the substitution principle and how it can help innovation, and you didn't focus too much on innovation in your talk here, in your presentation. But what are the positive effects that can really come out if we get the chemical industry on board when it comes to boosting safe innovation?
Well, the innovation is in the hands of industry, of course. They are the ones that can do this and have to do this. What the public, we need to create incentives to strengthen the legal mandates for substitution. The substitution principle has been strong in Swedish law and in the Nordic countries also, but very weak in EU law. So traditionally it has been almost that chemicals have almost human rights to exist. And I think this reversed triangle shows now that the Commission wants to strive towards safer and better chemicals. And there, I think that substitution principle is key to push out hazardous chemicals and replace them by safer alternatives, not necessarily other chemicals, but also safer technologies, and move in that direction. I think the chemical using industry, as Mikael talks about, industries that produces consumer articles, they are also pushing for this. So I hope not that also, as I said, the chemical producing industry will wake up and really contribute to this. It's a severe lack of taxpayers' money to have this huge process for regulating PFAS that the industry have known for decades that they are forever chemicals and toxicologically very problematic. So I think that is still quite disturbing, and I hope it will change.
Yes, thank you. We're getting a lot of questions in. Ian, are you there?
Yes, I'm here.
Let's see if I'll start with you, or otherwise Christina maybe can complement on this. One question that's come in is, does the strategy say anything about how to flag and trace hazardous substances in the production chain? The example with Cosmetica that Ian gave is a good example how it can go wrong.
I don't recall saying anything specific about that, but I agree it's a very important topic, and the supply chains are extremely complicated. So I think the example with cosmetics is that even the retailers quite often don't actually know what's in their products because in detail, because their supply chain is complicated. You know, the chemical manufacturers sell to someone downstream who sells to someone else, who sells to someone else. It eventually ends up in a product. I think that's a bit inexcusable. I think the retailers obviously have to know what's in their products, but we often, there's quite a few examples where the analytical chemists in our department have to sort of reverse engineer what's the content of a product, actually do an analytical work and try and work out what's in there, and sort of then inform the people who sell the product what's in there, which seems to be completely the the wrong way round. So yeah, I think it's a serious issue. I don't know if Christina or Mikael recalls anything specific.
Otherwise, I'll just, because time is running up. So we got one question about the consumers, and I thought maybe, Mikael, to see if you could perhaps answer this. You have to say, yes, I get you on screen. Mikael.
Yes.
There we go. Thank you. It was a short question that came in here at the end. When we look at the industry, we look at academia, we look at the institutions, but what's the role of the final consumers in the implementation of this strategy?
Well, let me first say that in the previous question, that there is language in the strategy about sustainable by design support network along value chains. So, but what that will result in is of course not clear. Consumers are referred to and mentioned in the strategy as a vulnerable group, and consumer products are focused, and the Commission states that it will extend the generic approach to risk management to ensure that consumer products, including a number of different types of products, are more or less safe or toxic free. But I would say that personally, I think that the main role of consumers in the organized sense as consumer organizations or environmental organizations is really to use the legislation that exists. We have the Chemical Secretariat, for instance, ChemSec in Sweden, which has established a list of substances to substitute, giving advice to companies. So that's the voice from the consumer or citizen side. And we have other consumer organizations, but there is already today an article, formulation Article 33 in the REACH regulation, giving consumers right, free of cost, when they buy a product, to know if it contains substances of high concern or not within 45 days. And that could, of course, be used by consumer organizations in a systematic manner to push within the frames of the existing legislation. And that's hardly done. So I would say that there's a big room already today, good opportunities already today for consumers to be more active and promote a toxic-free environment.
So being aware of your rights and making use of them. That's,
of course that requires the organized part of consumers, the consumer organizations, to provide that information in an easy, digestible way to their members.
For sure. Thank you all three very much for this. And thank you all for having watched this Baltic Breakfast, our second in English so far this year. All I want to do now is to say thank you very much to our speakers, and thank you very much for listening here today. And I want to wish you a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year's, staying in your small bubbles, enjoying the bubbles. And then our next breakfast, which will be in Swedish, will take place at the end of January. Thank you very much for today, and have a nice day.